on your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the former Yorkshire county cricketer Azeem Rafiq has spoken of constant racism while giving evidence to MPs about his time at the club. He's told the Sports Select Committee he believes cricket is institutionally racist. A report found the player suffered racial harassment and bullying, but Yorkshire initially decided to take no disciplinary action. Its new chairman, Lord Patel, says things need to change.
I want to make this the best county cricket club in the world, not just for cricket, but actually for having the right culture and having the right values going forward. And absolutely, I would like to be the template that goes forward.
The Prime Minister has written to the Commons Speaker proposing a ban on MPs acting as paid political consultants. Boris Johnson says it should be introduced as a matter of urgency following the row over Owen Paterson breaking lobbying rules. Scotland's COVID vaccine passport scheme could be extended out to cinemas, theatres and more hospitality venues from December the 6th. The First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has said a final decision won't be taken until next Tuesday. And university staff are to strike for 3 days next month in disputes over pensions, pay and working conditions. Members of the University and College Union at 58 universities will walk out on December the 1st following votes in favour of industrial action. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 24 points at 73.26. The pound buys $1.34 and €1.18. LBC weather: blustery showers for the northern half of the UK tonight, drier in the south, a low of 4 degrees. From Global's newsroom, I'm Dominic Ellis.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening. 2 minutes past 8 is the time on LBC. Welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. Lots to talk about tonight. I don't want to lead you in your questions, but you might want to ask about what's happened today at the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee with Azeem Rafiq giving evidence. You might want to ask on what Boris Johnson has announced on MP's second jobs today. Rather upstaging Keir Starmer, it has to be said, but lots of other questions that you can ask as well. Our panel tonight, we have Mark Harper with us, the former Conservative Chief Whip, Conservative MP for the Forest of Dean. Wendy Chamberlain is the Lib Dem Chief Whip. We've got a lot of whipping to get through on the programme tonight. She's also the Liberal Democrat MP for North East Fife. Owen Jones is here, the Guardian columnist, and Joanne Nadler, the Conservative commentator. They're here to take your calls. The number to call 0345 6060 973. And as ever, you can watch us on Global Player on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk or the LBC YouTube and Facebook feeds.
0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's crack on with our first question. It's from Margaret in Enfield. Hello, Margaret.
Hello, Ian. After what we've heard today from Azeem Rafiq, why does the colour of my skin or race emote such behaviour and hatred? What do the panel think needs to change to make it stop?
I'm very conscious that we have an all-white panel today, which, in a sense, I rather regret because I'm not sure that anybody who's white can answer the first bit of that question. Owen Jones.
I mean, no, and that's a really good point. The lived experience of people of colour needs to be at the absolute forefront of this whole discussion, and none of us have that lived experience on this panel. The testimony was horrific, absolutely horrific. It was so courageous for him to speak out about brutal, vicious experiences of institutionalised systemic racism in British cricket. And we say systemic because we've seen the fall in the number of British Pakistani cricket players over the last decade, and little wonder given the treatment that we have seen dealt out. And I think this is why it's so important to talk about systemic racism. And months ago, people of colour across the country felt gaslit, which means having their sense of reality denied by the British government, who published a report essentially denying systemic racism. But if we look across the board, it's not just about abuse, street-level abuse, which people of colour face. It's about the fact that if you're black, you're far more likely to be stopped and searched on suspicion of possession of drugs and to be charged if you are found with possession, unlike lots of British white Conservative cabinet ministers who've taken lots of drugs in their time. Whether it be you're more likely to be in poverty, to suffer unemployment, to suffer various levels of discrimination at every level of society. So we should look at sport, we should look at politics, we should look at the economy. Racism is, I'm afraid, ingrained in the very fabric of British society, and it needs a struggle, a collective struggle, but it needs white people to be allies, to listen, not to gaslight people of colour, to listen to their experiences and to fight against it, as I've said,
and
at
also,
the systemic level.
And also speak up.
To absolutely speak up, but also amplify. And I think that's important too, because...
What do you mean by that?
Well, because there's a danger that we speak over people. I mean, that's what we're kind of inadvertently doing here because we're white. It's important that, what I try to do myself, for example, is, if I'm writing about racism, then I will interview people who can talk based on the lived experience. I will retweet people based on the lived experience. I will share their articles, their videos. It's important we do that because we'll never understand. Look, we're both gay, and as much as straight people can...
Are you?
I've just come out, sorry, Mum. As much as... a real bombshell there. Look, but the fact is, we know there are straight people who want to be allies and to support us, but they'll never know exactly what it's like to suffer homophobia. They can do their best to listen, but it's best when people's own lived experiences are amplified. That's what happened today. Let's continue to do that. But we have such a long way to go against the fight against racism, and that's what today's testimony underlined.
Mark Harper, I don't know if there's anything you wish to share with our listeners along the lines of what Owen just said. Probably not. But
funnily enough, despite the fact that I don't often agree with Owen, on his point about listening to people, I do agree with him. And I think it was very welcome that the Select Committee had Azim Rafiq giving his evidence today. Obviously, because he was covered by parliamentary privilege, he could be very frank about his experience, and that was largely, I think, broadcast, so people could hear it at home. And some of it, the broadcasters had to have the little offensive language thing in the corner, but that was good that they broadcast it, because I think people needed to hear what he'd had to put up with. And I listened to some of the evidence that those involved in the cricket club, and I think the outgoing chairman, I think, basically conceded under some questioning that there was a problem with institutional racism in that cricket club,
which he failed to tackle.
Yes, and I hope the new chairman, who I think also gave evidence, Lord Patel of Bradford, I think effectively now has a mission to kind of grab hold of that cricket club and sort it out. And I agree with what Owen said about you've got a very significant number of youngsters from an ethnic minority background who follow cricket, and I think something like 40% of them get driven out of the game, which is a tragedy, and there's far too few of them going on. So I think listening to the testimonies is valuable, and then particularly those of us who don't have that lived experience need to listen to it and think about what we can do to improve things for those people that have that lived experience. And that, I think, was like listening to what Margaret's got to say there as well, and listen to that and try and use the experience of others to change what they have experienced going forward.
Wendy Chamberlain, you're a Scottish MP. I mean, cricket isn't as popular in Scotland, I don't think, as it is in England. But, I mean, in a sense, this transcends cricket, doesn't it? This goes on in virtually every walk of life. What can be done? I mean, there's no silver bullet solution here, is there? But what can be done to make people from ethnic minority backgrounds feel as though they are treated exactly the same as everybody else?
Yeah, so I was a police officer for 12 years, and I was a police officer during the time of the Lawrence inquiry, and I remember completing my 3 days of diversity training as an outcome of the report, which rightly labelled the Metropolitan Police at that time, and the police service generally, as institutionally racist. And I do remember speaking to somebody at the end of it and her saying, I just think we should treat everybody the same. That's absolutely the ambition of what we should get to, but clearly what we need to be doing is treating people according to their particular needs. and Owen and Mark have rightly highlighted the fact that we need to listen to people with real lived experience and understand what they're doing. The other thing that came for me today was actually the power of select committees. We've obviously seen Parliament not at its best over the last couple of weeks, but to have a select committee hearing about the Yorkshire report and rightly calling it in to hear Iain Rafique's testimony today, I think was very powerful, and that came across very well. In terms of what we need to do, I think we really need to tackle this thing called banter, because in and of itself, banter is exclusionary, and whichever way that banter is used to exclude somebody, it's wrong. If it's not appropriate to see it in a newspaper or tell your mum that you've said it, it's not appropriate within those settings, and it clearly is endemic across a number of organisations, and it's clearly endemic across a number of sports as well. You know, cricket is the latest, but we know the abuse that England footballers experienced during the World Cup, and we all need to step up and do more about it.
Joanne?
I think Iain Rafique has absolutely failed, wasn't he, by Yorkshire Cricket Club, and anybody watching his testimony today or listening to it, I think, would feel both sickened and very angry. So is there a problem in Yorkshire Cricket Club? Undoubtedly. And is there a problem in the wider game? I mean, cricket is not something that I follow. It's not something I know very much about. But if what he had to say today was in any way typical, then yes, there is a problem. I wouldn't want to see a situation where we want to amplify how we treat everybody based first and foremost on their race and on their colour. Although, of course, there are situations, and this, I mean, you couldn't, in a way, get a clear-cut example, it seems to me, of racism. I mean, the sort of things that Iain Rafique was talking about today were just horrendous, absolutely horrendous.
But what gets me is that, I mean, if you think one of the things he said was when he was a 15-year-old, in a sort of laddish, beery way, I guess, one of his teammates poured red wine down his throat. Now, you don't have to be very intelligent to work out that a Muslim doesn't drink.
No, quite.
And yet none of his teammates intervened. That's what I find so shocking about this.
And that's where I do actually agree with Owen about people needing to speak up when they see this kind of thing happening around them. They definitely do. And there's something about the culture, it would appear, in that club that precluded that from happening. And that does seem to be fairly scandalous. But Owen mentioned, not by name, but I presume he was talking about the Sewell report, which my understanding of it was written predominantly by people who are not white. And they would take a different view on structural racism to that expounded by Owen. So are you saying that their view shouldn't be considered? Because at the same, on the one hand, you're saying that people
in the way they were,
aren't you gaslighting the authors of that report?
There were gay people who opposed equal marriage. I remember when Milo Yiannopoulos went on national television as a gay man.
There's a name from the past.
Indeed, he's now on television selling wares on a Christian fundamentalist channel, but he called himself ex-gay. But he went on as a gay man to argue, I remember on TV, against equal marriage as a gay man. There's always members of a minority who go against the grain of the overall position of that particular minority. And the view, if you look at the polling, for example, of black people in this country, CNN and YouGov today cleared a poll early this year, by large majorities, British black citizens felt, for example, the police was systemically racist. So the issue with that report is, from the perspective of communities who do face racism and experience racism, that individuals were selected who did not share a wider view amongst those minorities. There were no minorities homogenous. They were always dissenting. I mean, in the same way, I remember, who led the fight in America against the Equal Rights Amendment to give women equal rights? Phyllis Schlafly, and handpicked women who opposed equal rights for women. There were always examples of people who, in groups who suffer oppression, who then you get exceptions who are then amplified as though they are somehow representative when they're not. We do have to, objectively, the polling, the statistics show that if you are black, you are far more likely to suffer poverty and unemployment, that you face discrimination on a whole range of levels. That's what we have to fight
It's
against.
how you interpret those statistics, though.
What do you mean how do you interpret statistics? For example,
I think
that if you're black and if you're black and white, and a white person who is found with cannabis or cocaine on them, and a black person with cannabis and cocaine on them, a black person is far more likely to be charged.
Well, it's interesting that you should raise that issue, because I have some sympathy with you on that. I think that you mentioned cabinet ministers
who snort coke, and according to Dominic Cummings, there are still Conservative politicians who take drugs.
And I think that any politician that takes drugs should probably should come within the remit of the law.
Well, I don't agree. I think the law is ludicrous, but that's a completely different.
That's a call to change the law.
We agree that the law falls differently depending on the colour of your skin. That's the point.
Law should be applied equally to everybody, and that's really my point. Is that I think that some of the stuff that's done in the name of anti-racism actually promotes and provokes differences.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
I mean that
the differences are caused by racism.
If your opening analysis is that you should treat somebody differently, that you should ascribe to them a set of beliefs simply because of the colour of their skin or simply because of their religious background, then that, it seems to me, to be a very divisive way to go about.
That's not what's been argued.
For me, actually, what's come out of this discussion, the most important thing for today was, particularly as you said, Iain, given that we're an all-white panel, for me, the most important thing was to listen to his testimony about the impact of what people had said and how they treated him, and to think about that so that, you know, when we see examples of things, is to be the person that might not be affected but does something about it, when perhaps the person being treated badly doesn't feel they're in a position to do it, and be the person that says, no, that's not acceptable. And I've done that in the past, and we probably all ought to do it more when we see somebody being treated badly, is to put our hand up and go, no, that isn't acceptable.
And I think particularly,
I think that is the lesson I'm going to take away
if you
from
are in
today.
a position of leadership, I think it is almost incumbent on you to do so. It's much more difficult if you're a junior person in an organisation to do this. Text here saying, hypocrisy, Iain. Are you claiming you've never heard racism from your Conservative chums? Are you willing to call them out now? I doubt it. Well, I can look you in the eye and say that I have honestly never heard a Conservative MP make a racist remark. And I'll tell you what, if I did, I absolutely would call them out on it.
Did you call out Boris Johnson when he compared Muslim women to bank robbers and letterboxes? And according to the statistics, then drove a huge surge in Islamophobic crimes when people went up to Muslim women and shoved pound notes in there.
I did actually.
Well, there we go. So you have heard them say it.
Not to me.
Well, fine.
If I've been in a conversation with people, I've never heard anybody come out with a remark like that.
But we know they do say them, because Boris Johnson said he said black people are picking innies with watermelon smiles.
Well, he didn't say that.
Let's not go over this, because
it's important though. That's the Prime Minister of a country. He says racism.
He was actually writing an article
in which he was criticising
from
Boris Johnson.
Hang on, let Joanne say this, because it is important that it wasn't banter, but it wasn't how you were interpreting it.
Yes. He wrote an article in which he was actually satirising people who used that kind of language.
That's not how.
If you read the article,
it is.
I have read the article, and I've read the anger it caused black people, and I've also read, for example, comments calling gay men tank top.
Well, again, if you read that in context, that is not a homophobic comment that he's made.
I'm sorry, straight people should not be using terms like tank top bum boys. This is ludicrous. But obviously, the Prime Minister has said a number. Including specifically calling. We say this, dismiss it.
Right.
It's the Prime Minister
comparing. I'm not dismissing.
No, but the Prime Minister did compare Muslim women to bank robbers and letterboxes, and that did drive a surge in hate crimes.
Text, all I'm saying is I have never been in a conversation with Conservative MPs who've used racist language, and if I had been, I would have called them out, and I hope people can believe that.
I would believe you. That.
Right, let's move on to a different subject in a moment. It's 18 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
It's
Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
21 minutes past 8. We have Mark Harper, Wendy Chamberlain, Owen Jones and Joanne Nadler with us answering your calls. 0345 6060 973. Lenny is in Ashford. Hello, Lenny. Oh, no, it's a text question. I always get this wrong. Right. Boris Johnson says he wants to stop MPs exploiting their positions, but how successfully does the panel think the government will police his new rules? Wendy.
Well, both Mark and I spoke in the debate today where the government finally completed the U-turn from the position they took on the 3rd of November, where they decided to conflate the processes, changing the standards processes with saving Owen Paterson. And I obviously had the emergency debate on standards in Parliament last week. And the reason I did that, the reason why I called for that, it was partly driven by Kwasi Kwarteng's comments, because it did feel like we were, on the Thursday morning, it did feel that we were stepping well beyond a line. But second of all, it was about the fact that actually this is House business, and it's really important that MPs across the House had their say on what had happened. And this does feel like a little bit like we are back to where we were 2 weeks ago in terms of quick decisions being made, the decision, for example, to save Owen Paterson. And now today, let's make some statement about second jobs just at the point where Keir Starmer is going to make a briefing. And I think, again, what we are going to see is back of a fag packet and what are the actual consequences of what Boris Johnson has called on this afternoon. I think there's a lot of clarity to be worked through. And final point is we are politicising the issue again. The Prime Minister has tried to usurp Keir Starmer, has written to the Speaker, this is the government saying this is business of the House. This is standard processes are owned by the whole House.
He's written to the Speaker to ask the Speaker to make the necessary arrangements for this to happen. How is that politicising it?
Well, because it is looking at...
I mean, he has usurped Keir Starmer. That is politicising. You're absolutely right on that.
Absolutely. But what we all agreed, or what there was general consensus about across the House last week, was that there's actually lots of recommendations already in place. The Commission, Standards in Public Life Committee has reported in the last couple of weeks. There have previously been recommendations about second jobs, etc. So it seems quite funny to me now, and I think it is political that the Prime Minister is deciding to do something about it now when he has not done so before.
Couldn't you just welcome a sinner that repenteth?
Well, again, it's about agreeing things on a cross-party basis. So you could argue this is a cross-party, that here we have the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister in agreement, but it also sounds like we are taking decisions that should be taken in proper time. We should be waiting for the Standards Committee to report in relation to the Code of Conduct, and we should be looking at this properly in the round. The government failed to do that 2 weeks ago, and it feels like there has been a coach and horses driven through current processes, and now we're frantically trying to put everything back in the box, because it reflects badly on all of us, and I'm sure Mark would agree with that.
And Mark, you were fairly outspoken about what happened last week, or was it the week before?
Yeah, well, it was the happening was 2 weeks ago, and my speech was last week. So look, several things going on here. On the timing issue, the government's thing today clearly it's driven by the fact there's a debate tomorrow, and of course, in some senses, the opposition have picked the subject for the debate, and the government had to respond to it because we're going to have to vote on something.
And personally, it's going to be a binding vote, I gather.
Personally, well, yes, but I don't think an opposition day debate is actually a very good, forum for having this discussion, because it will. I just know how it will be very partisan tomorrow, probably, which is not a great backdrop.
Even though
if we just step back from that, the actual substance of what the Prime Minister's put forward is actually partly from a report which Wendy alluded to, that the Committee on Standards in Public Life produced in 2018, which actually is very sensible, which tightens up the rules about the sorts of roles MPs can take outside Parliament, which I think is very sensible. On Lenny's specific question about the policing of it, part of the reason why I spoke out last week, I think the standards process is actually pretty robust. I mean, part of the problem we got into was the government tried to not follow it through, but the Standards Committee and the Commissioner did a very exhaustive investigation into what Owen Paterson had done. They took evidence, they published it all. I read the report in detail. He had broken the rules, he needed to be punished. They took into account, in terms of the length of the sanction, the tragedy that had befallen his family, so they'd exercised some level of mercy with an appropriate punishment. I think that's right. But the right thing to do would have been for the House to just agree it. So I think we've got a robust system which I think treats MPs fairly, but firmly to make sure they follow the rules.
In terms of second jobs, though, which that's what the subject of.
Well, Lenny's question was, do people have confidence that the new rules are going to be properly policed? And I think we have a robust standard system, which, by the way, does include lay members. So it's not just MPs; it's 7 MPs cross-party, but it's also 7 lay members from outside Parliament.
But the letter that Boris Johnson has sent to the Speaker today is about second jobs, and
yes,
he wants to outlaw consultancies.
Yes.
Now, that would affect, I think, about 30 MPs. But, of course, everyone's going to disagree about, well, what is a consultancy and what is going to be allowed under this system. And that is where the party politics, I suspect, is going to come here. Joanne?
Yes, I mean, I think that it's defining that, which goes to the heart of the question from Lenny, actually, in terms of how this can be policed. I mean, it shouldn't be the government that has to police it; it'll be the authorities of the House. I mean, what an utter and total. I've got to
cluster shambles. That's what you mean.
Quite.
Cluster burach.
What?
You're looking for cluster burach.
Oh, I like that one. I'm going to nick that.
Just thank you so much for helping me with that, because I was realising I was getting myself down a cul-de-sac of potential foul language there. But yeah, I mean, this has been an absolutely appalling episode, completely mishandled by Number 10. There's no other way of looking at it. And it has revealed one thing, though, that I think people, and I certainly was surprised, that MPs were allowed to act as consultants in this way. It seems that seemed to me to fly in the face of all the sort of reforms and things that we've seen in recent years. So if the unintended consequence of the, and I'm not quite sure what the word was you used, Wendy, but I'll have to check. Leads to more transparency in that regard. I think it's probably a good thing. I have one slight reservation, and that is, if you look overall at the culture of politics in this country, I'm not sure that we could, the non-politicians among us, hand on heart say that we've all been better served as politicians have become more professional politicians. So there's a little bit of me that sort of has a sentimental attachment to the idea of the sort of part-time MP who actually does something else or has done quite a lot before they come into the House.
You're so 1990s, Joanne.
I don't know, I think I'm 1890s in that regard.
Owen?
Yeah, I mean, I think the worry is, for me, that it won't go far enough. I mean, look, a quarter of Tory MPs have so-called second jobs. I say so-called second jobs because I actually think part of the problem is people see being an MP as a job when it isn't. It's a public service. It used to be the case that MPs weren't paid at all, which was bad. They got a stipend in 1911 because before that it was a rich man's club. You could afford to stand if you're working class, or you had to have trade unions to sponsor you. And now MPs are in the top 5% of earners if they're a backbencher, 3 times the median income in this country. They're doing very well. And bear in mind, by the way, YouGov did a poll about this. What did most people in the country think was rich? And I say this because a lot of journalists, I think, at the top end might not be able to understand this, but 60% of people thought 60 grand is rich, and MPs are paid 82 grand. So we've got to be aware of where most people in the country are actually at. I do think there are exemptions to be made when it comes to public service, because I think having MPs on frontline public services seeing the impact of government policies on them, I think that's a good thing. Without making an LBC exemption, I do think you can see the case for journalism as an exemption, because MPs, politicians communicating with the general public at a time of cynicism towards politicians, I can see the case for that as well. But the danger is, what was happening with private consultancies is private sector firms see that MPs are well connected, they can put pressure on the government, they can ask questions that put ministers on the spot and get results. They know people perhaps in Number 10, and that is a way of subverting democracy, because it's a way of business interest.
You're not allowed to do any of those things.
But
that's all against the rules.
But it's very difficult to
enforce. Why do these companies employ MPs to be their effective parliamentary advisors? There can only be one explanation for that.
It's not just that's all the freebies they get as well.
But there are other people. I mean, I hesitate to name somebody, but I mean, one MP that I'm thinking of who's recently written a very good autobiography, okay, I'll say Andrew Mitchell. I mean, he worked for Lazard Brothers before he became an MP, and he still does work for them now and is quite handsomely remunerated for that. Now, he's not lobbying the government to do anything. He's not a consultant in the traditional way.
That was just one example, I think, of the problem with it. The other is MPs should be focusing on representing their constituents, and lots of constituency MPs are just so hard pressed they couldn't imagine doing anything else on the side. And I also think working for private consultancies binds MPs to the interests of those often very wealthy vested interests rather than those of constituents who are, I don't know, having their universal credit cut, who have been driven into poverty, who stare at the ceiling, unable to sleep at night because they're terrified of opening that energy bill on their kitchen table. And if MPs are so divorced from those experiences because they're so handsomely remunerated by these rich business interests, that is bad for democracy, clearly.
Okay. Well,
I broadly agree with that, but the one thing I would say is that there are people in the public sector who are, quite rightly paid well when they get to be, say, a head teacher or a fairly sort of senior person in the NHS. And if we want those kind of people to go into politics, do we expect them?
No, do you know what? I think if you're not willing to be a public servant on 3 times the median income, then you shouldn't be an MP. And I think that's a good way of filtering people out. If you're so dedicated to public service and you think you'd be such a great champion of your constituency, you're not going to be deterred by only being paid the top 5%. The real issue, I think, what's happened is because in the city and elsewhere salaries have exploded, MPs rub shoulders with those people. They see the fact that they can put all their kids in private school without, and it's just a bit of pocket money, and if you're an MP you'd struggle to put all your kids in a private school. That's when they get resentful and think, well, why don't we get a slice of the pie? And I think that's what's really going on here.
More to come. 0345 6060 973. I'd like to put a question to our panel. It's 8:32 on LBC. Time for the news headlines with Dominic Ellis.
The Prime Minister has commended former Yorkshire cricketer Azeem Rafiq for speaking out against racism in the sport. The 30-year-old has told the Sports Select Committee he was made to feel isolated and humiliated during his 8 years at the club. The Prime Minister wants to ban MPs from working as political consultants following the Owen Paterson row. Boris Johnson has written to the Commons Speaker about plans to tighten paid lobbying rules. And university staff are to strike for 3 days next month in disputes over pensions, pay and working conditions. Union members at 58 institutions will walk out on December the 1st. LBC weather: blustery showers for the northern half of the UK tonight, drier in the south, a low of 4 degrees.
This is LBC.
Winter's on.
Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
8:36. Mark Harper, Joanne Nadler, Wendy Chamberlain and Owen Jones with us answering your questions. 0345 6060 973. I thought we'd have a nice easy one next from Robert in Leighton. Hello, Robert.
Hello. If the situation between Russia and Ukraine deteriorates quite sharply, should NATO militarily intervene?
Mark Harper, I'm trying to recall. I don't think you've been a Foreign Office or Defence Minister, have you? That delight lies.
No, I was a shadow Defence Minister. So I've been involved in some of these discussions, and I was an Immigration Minister, but I've not been a minister in either of those two departments. So I think NATO should get involved, but I would drop the military bit. So I think the first thing we should do...
Isn't that what NATO is, a military bit?
Yes, but part of this is about deterrence. So part of what should be happening now is some very clear signals to Russia about the unacceptability of what we think it might be proposing, and the United States has warned what they think it's proposing. The best outcome is we persuade them not to do anything. That's the best outcome. I think, from my experience in politics, when I've had to talk to soldiers involved in military action, some of whom come back damaged physically and mentally, and families where they don't come back, military action should be a last resort, and you have to be very, very clear that there wasn't anything else you could do. So you absolutely shouldn't rush into military action. You've got to try lots of things before you get there.
But deterrence only works if the other side believe that you will take military action. And that's the problem here. In that I don't think Putin does believe that the West would react in any way at all.
But it shouldn't be the first thing you do. And there are lots of other things that you need to do using your foreign defence policy with your allies. So part of the point here, because Robert mentions NATO, the really big thing is to demonstrate that the NATO alliance is going to act collectively and speak with one voice.
But Ukraine is not a member of NATO, so there's no Article 5 implication here.
But it sends a powerful message. If Russia's trying to pick off the West with its, using the Nord Stream pipeline and its energy resources, and it's trying to pick us off. And what's important is we stick together, give a clear lead and a clear message, and the US and Britain are obviously the two biggest military partners in NATO, and make it clear that we've got a range of tools. We shouldn't rule out military intervention, but it absolutely shouldn't be the first thing we launch into if something happens.
Owen Jones, there are reportedly 100,000 Russian troops near the Ukraine border. They're presumably there for a reason. What can NATO do to deter Russia from saying, OK, we're going to invade Ukraine?
Well, I mean, look, we can't have a nuclear... I'm sorry to have to say this, we can't have a nuclear war with Russia, which I'm afraid is what military intervention would mean. It would mean a very strong likelihood of an exchange of nuclear missiles, which would kill tens of millions of people and render most of Europe uninhabitable. So I don't really think we should end up in that particular situation. Look, Putin is a grotesque, despotic authoritarian who rules over a kleptocratic, despicable regime, and the annexation of Crimea is not something which anybody, for example, could justify, which they obviously did. I do think there's a problem with the various precedents set with violating international law, both by Russia and by the West, because unfortunately, if you look back and people roll their eyes when you mention the Iraq War, I realise that it's just some tiny little thing we just forget about. But the problem with that, which the UN General Secretary at the time said violated international law, is if you set various precedents, then every state can go, well, if they're not going to abide by international law, why should we? And that, unfortunately, international law has been shredded by the actions of the West and by Russia, all of which have left it basically in tatters and states acting in unilateral ways with terrible consequences. So I think, obviously, what we need is a negotiated, peaceful climb down. The integrity of Ukraine, obviously, we need to support. There can't be any more Russian intervention against the sovereign state. But there's just no question, I'm afraid, of military action. Anyone who's proposing that is talking about a nuclear war, because the West and Russia are nuclear-armed states. And if you have an exchange of nuclear missiles, then we're talking about the obliteration of large chunks of human civilization, which no one actually has the appetite for.
And then we've got the China-Taiwan situation, which we talked about on the programme last night. It's very worrying times, Internet. I mean, I suppose, look, whenever we have conversations, there are flashpoints throughout the world. But these two, Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, seem to be potentially more dangerous than anything that we've experienced in recent memory.
Yeah, and they've obviously been, as Owen and Mark alluded to, simmering away for some time. I mean, I certainly agree with Mark that we need to be ensuring that we act collectively under NATO, but we also need to ensure that we are working closely with both the US and the EU. And one of the big concerns I have is, there seems to be a degree of grandstanding going on here. There's certainly grandstanding from a Russia perspective. We know that, for example, coronavirus in Russia continues to cause issues there. Putin's administration don't want to admit that. And so, in some ways, Ukraine is a bit of a distraction. But on the other hand as well, I think here
it's amazing we haven't thought of that.
We've got the UK government
Don't encourage them.
Talking about implementing Article 16 in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol. That isn't exactly how to make friends and influence people when we need to be focused on building relationships with the EU and US so that we can provide a front, a collective, joint front to this act of Russian aggression.
I was about to start an argument about the Northern Ireland Protocol, but thought better of it. Joanne.
Well, I mean, as you say, there are troops amassing on the border, so I think NATO should be prepared to respond with ground troops if necessary. I don't think that would mean that automatically we'd be moving into a nuclear theatre, but clearly that is not where any of this is where we want to be heading. So I think this requires a kind of joint approach across the EU in terms of sanctions, across NATO in terms of what they might be able to do militarily. And I don't know that we can see it necessarily in exclusion from what's going on in Belarus as well. I think it was encouraging to see that Germany, I think, have put some kind of stop on the Nord Stream gas pipeline from Russia today. So I don't think you can see this in isolation. This is saber-rattling by Russia. And I think we do have to be prepared for a military response as the last resort.
Yeah, I mean, I do think if you're having soldiers from the West and Russia fighting each other, you're heading towards a potential nuclear
exchange. I'm not advocating,
but no, of course. But I think,
not advocating that we just stand by and say, "Well, come on."
What you said about gas is really important because it does show we need energy independence, and investing far more in renewable energy isn't just about the climate emergency. It's stopping us being dependent, for example, on Russia, which then gets leverage.
Well, I can remember Liam Fox banging on to me about 10 years ago about energy security, and my eyes sort of glazed over, but he was really onto something. Robert in Leighton, what's your answer to your own question?
Well,
are you still there, Robert?
I'll probably go with Owen Jones, really, actually. The West have set terrible precedent down the years, and now our chickens are coming home to roost. I mean, the war in Iraq was a disaster. The war in Iraq was a disaster.
Thank you very much, Robert. More to come on Cross Question, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:45.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Weekday mornings from 7.
Yesterday, the threat went to severe. So the government then put out a security minister, and there are obviously going to be questions. How come this guy was initially denied his asylum claim in 2014 and stayed another 7 years? What is the process?
Look, I'm not making excuses, but there are complex issues, sometimes complex legal issues around appeals.
They seem fair questions to me. We are surely allowed a little more detail than we got.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:48 with us, Mark Harper, Wendy Chamberlain, Owen Jones and Joanne Nadler. Let's go to our next question. It's Philip in Archway. Hello, Philip.
Good evening. What does the panel think of the shenanigans surrounding the government's attempt to get Paul Dacre chosen as the new chair of Ofcom?
So this is the former editor of the Daily Mail, Sir Paul Dacre. The government is rumoured to want him to be the new chair of Ofcom, the body that regulates me. Joanne Nadler.
Well, I don't think very highly of the shenanigans, but I think the idea that the government might want to put somebody in place here who didn't come from the normal kind of liberal elite point of view is not such a bad idea. And we shouldn't forget that Ofcom, when it was first set up, I think the guy heading it up was Ed Richards. It was set up by Tony Blair. Ed Richards was a close associate of Tony Blair. So the idea that these things are sort of completely immune from politics, whilst it might be nice, I think is somewhat naive.
That's a fair point, isn't it, Owen Jones, that sort of when Labour in power, they appoint people sympathetic to them to these posts. Why shouldn't the Tories do it too?
Well, they shouldn't. I'm no fan of New Labour stuffing people in various
This is true, I can vouch for that.
So there we have it. No, I mean, look, in this case, we've got a former Tory advisor married to a Tory MP and brother-in-law of former Tory communications chief on the panel to help install Paul Dacre, who is obviously the pro-government choice. Look, most newspapers in this country support the Conservatives, actually in quite a partisan way. They're having a bit of a blip at the moment because of the corruption scandal, but editorially, in a general election and beyond, most newspapers support the Conservative government. My worry about where we're heading, I've been to Hungary, I'm not sure if anyone else has. That's formerly a democracy, but in which a centre-right party has radicalised in power and stuffed institutions full of lackeys. And we should have a demarcation, it's embarrassing to have to say this, between the media and the government. And if you've got someone like Paul Dacre, who was a, let's put it, pretty demagogic right-wing editor of a right-wing newspaper.
Very successful.
A newspaper which has peddled all sorts of racism and bigotry and misinformation.
Led the campaign to get justice for Stephen Lawrence.
Do you know what happened? That happened not because originally the Daily Mail were not going to do that. It's because Paul Dacre found out that Stephen Lawrence's dad worked for him beforehand and helped do his house. That's why that happened. That was an exception. The Daily Mail has run viciously anti-Muslim and various racist campaigns, misinformation, but above all else, he's a pro-government stooge. And Ofcom is supposed to regulate a media in a fair way, and we're going to end up with most newspapers supporting the government, and then the head of Ofcom, a pro-government stooge regulating them. It's ludicrous.
Wendy.
So I think this question, Philip, actually goes back to the earlier two questions around today's DCMS panel and the question in relation to MP second jobs. To take the second one first, I think the reason why it goes back to that is because it's background to the government trying to change the rules to suit themselves. They didn't get the outcome that they wanted in the first place, and now they're trying to fix it. And in the second part, for me, goes to a bit to what Owen referred to there in terms of toxic cultures. You only have to have a look at what Paul Dacre oversaw at the Daily Mail to know that that is not a right and proper culture in any organisation, let alone one that is involved in scrutiny as Ofcom is.
Mark?
Well, I think, as far as I understand it, this appointment, the chair, it's a political, it's appointed by ministers, and the test for ministers is they have a process where they look to see whether people are qualified to do the job. And I think someone who's run a significant national newspaper, you can't pretend they don't know about the media and they don't know what they're talking about. And the process gives ministers a choice of people who are qualified to do the job.
I'm sure I read somewhere that he doesn't watch television, though.
Well,
is that right?
Well, I have no idea whether he watches television, but that's actually not the job of the chair of Ofcom. I mean, they've got a lot of people who do the regulation. You don't personally, as the chair, watch television programmes.
You set the parameters
and then
for
make
the organisation.
decisions about individual programmes.
You kind of need to know a little bit about the general area that you're regulating.
Yeah, but I don't think someone who's run a national newspaper doesn't know about the media. So the question is somebody qualified to do the job professionally? Do they have the skills? But ultimately, all of these jobs are appointed by democratically elected politicians who are accountable both to the House of Commons and to the public for the decisions they make.
Can I ask you, Mark?
And if he's appointed, I don't know whether he is, I don't know whether ministers want to appoint him, then ministers will be accountable.
So, can I ask you, Mark, if a Labour government just appointed the editor of the Daily Mirror to the head of Ofcom, you'd go, well, they know about newspapers, don't they? Is that what you'd say, genuinely? Hand on heart?
Hand on heart. As Iain said, no, but... Would you say that? Hand on heart? I wouldn't expect to agree
Not
with
if it was Piers Morgan.
Political appointments that a Labour government made, which is Ian's point at the beginning.
But you wouldn't say that. You would say that was a biased position, surely. You wouldn't just say they've got newspaper experience, therefore they're...
No, I judge them on how they did the job. If they're qualified to do it, there are lots of rules about how Ofcom operates. It's got legal rules about how it has to conduct itself, and whoever's the chair and the chief executive and who chairs...
Why are the government so keen to get this one guy in?
Well, I'm not even sure they are. You're asserting that.
Well, they are. They've gone to huge levels. They've got all sorts of people on the panel to make sure...
I've been on the panel before.
I've no idea who their preferred candidate is.
The guy that you're referring to has been appointed to the interview panel, Michael Simmons. I first knew him in the 1990s. Temperamentally, I would suggest that he's not a natural soulmate of Paul Dacre. I'll just leave it there, but you may be right. Who knows?
What happens on that? He has been assessed as being an appropriate first time round. It is the second bite of the cherry that is part of the issue.
Let's move on, because I want to fit in one more question and then a text. Philip, thank you very much. Let's go to James in Watford. Hello, James.
Good evening. If none of us had any debt, would we become better people?
Oh, I love questions like this. Would we be better people? We'd probably be a lot less well off in terms of material things, wouldn't we? Wendy?
Yeah, I think obviously, I suppose it depends how you define debt. I'm assuming that you're meaning purely in a financial sense, but I think, actually it's appropriate for us to feel obligations to people, because sometimes that's what helps us to do the right thing as well. Clearly, part of the reason why I came into politics was to help people, to support people who don't have sufficient or need help to get what they require. And clearly, if there was no want, you would like, MPs would be redundant in some regards, and you would like to think life would be better. But would it make us better people? Sadly, the course of human nature and human history suggests that even those who have plenty aren't necessarily fine and upstanding.
Owen?
It'll make us happier. I mean, debtors are often demonised, but as irresponsible. They're irresponsible lenders. I mean, that's what caused the credit crisis in the first place. Lenders lending irresponsibly in a way that caused a financial calamity. The reason people end up in debt overwhelmingly is their living standards are too low. It's not because they're bad people, and
or they're very materialistic.
Well,
they want something and they want it now.
One of my friends was chair of a debt charity, and the point he always made to me, and didn't have my politics at all. I should make that clear. He's a now committed Christian evangelical preacher, but he said that the best people at managing their money were poor people, because they absolutely had to. Mm-hmm. And so actually, people who end up in debt because most people in poverty in this country in working households, they're doing the right thing as they're told. So people end up in debt overwhelmingly just because they don't have enough to survive. So if we want people to do that, then we need higher wages and higher living standards, not quite in universal credit. That would help. Lots of people end up in debt as a consequence. So we should stop demonising people and saying it's bad personal choices. It isn't.
Sharon?
I think James's question goes to the heart of something that's very little discussed in politics today, which is monetary policy. And over the last 30 years, we've moved away from any sense that money has any real value, that it's tied to anything. We've had this huge expansion of credit. We've had this huge expansion of quantitative easing and effectively cheap money. And I think it's not surprising that people have taken on more debt in a personal sense.
Because we're almost encouraged to, aren't we?
Quite. Would it make us better people if we didn't have it? And actually, on this, I agree with Owen. I think it probably would make us happier. I don't think this has been helpful. I think it's driven up the price of assets. I think it's created more kind of a lack of it's created huge kind of disparities as well, I think, in wealth. And I think this is something that governments really need to address.
Mark?
And it's inflationary.
James, I don't think said whether it was debt you could afford to service. I mean, if you borrow money and you can afford to borrow it, most people borrow money to buy a house or to get something they want now, as you said, which is perfectly reasonable if you can afford it. So that's one issue. I don't think there's anything intrinsically wrong with that.
I'm interpreting it as consumer debt.
Right. But again, I don't think if you can afford it, if you want something now and you can afford it, I don't think there's anything wrong with borrowing the money to get something. The second half, though, I don't think is connected. Whether you are a good person and you try and behave well and do the right thing, I don't think is connected to how much money you've got or whether you've borrowed money. Those are choices, and people with very little money and people in debt can make good choices and bad choices, and people with loads of money can make good choices and bad choices, and we can all decide to do that. So I think that I don't think the two halves are joined together.
Very good question, James. Thank you very much indeed. Now, text question for the end of the programme is this. This is from Matt in Essex. We're heading towards Christmas. Is Die Hard a Christmas film or not? And a supplementary question from Corey, my producer. What's your favourite Christmas film? Mark?
Well, the original Die Hard film absolutely is a Christmas film. It's set at Christmas and it's a Christmas film, and I'm gonna kind of stick to that. And actually, I really like it. So there we go. That's both in one.
Actually, I saw it for the first time last Christmas.
Where have you been?
Yeah. And insofar as it's set at Christmas, then evidently it's a Christmas film.
Should be getting around to The Sound of Music next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think The Sound of Music in many ways would be a more appropriate Christmas film.
Yeah. Okay. And your favourite?
I'm not sure I have a favourite Christmas film, really.
Okay. Wendy?
Die Hard is absolutely a Christmas film. I think the fact that it's now part of the Christmas programming suggests that it's been widely accepted as a Christmas film. My favourite film, It's a Wonderful Life, definitely gives us the good warm feelings, particularly based on our last question. And if from the kids, it's got to be Elf.
Haven't seen either. Owen?
Die Hard is a Christmas film. The end. Favourite Christmas film? You know what? I actually think it's a ludicrous, ridiculous, problematic film. But I Love Actually, for me, the reason I say it, every year I watch it, it doesn't feel like it's Christmas until I watch it. No, and every time I watch it, I realise it's even more ludicrous and honestly quite problematic. Like all sorts of men being really creepy, essentially, the more you see it. But I just don't think it's Christmas until I see it. I know. I mean, I know it's not a good film.
It is a good film. It's a brilliant film. I love it. And I look forward to watching it this Christmas. Well, thank you very much to Mark Harper, to Joanne Nadler, to Wendy Chamberlain and Owen Jones. We'll have another cross question for you tomorrow evening at the same time. Coming up in a moment, we're going to be talking about MP's second jobs. Boris Johnson rather usurped Keir Starmer today in what some people think was a rather clever move. Others think it was just a little bit grubby. But what is the solution to the MP's second jobs programme? I'm relying on you to tell me in just a moment. It's 9 o'clock.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the Prime Minister has praised the former Yorkshire cricketer Azeem Rafiq for speaking out about the racism he